very unique circumstances around being a disabled journalist in particular. I feel like disability is still often seen as an inherently negative identity. It's not even seen as an identity. But I think because of that, both in news coverage as well as how people with disabilities are viewed in the newsroom, like in terms of workplace culture, it affects both ends. And so you mentioned inspiration porn, and this idea that like I guess I can define inspiration porn. It's a genre of reporting and view of people with disabilities that typically in stories were viewed as like an inspiration or portrayed as a superhero for doing really everyday things, whether it's a promposal. So for example, there's a lot of news stories that come out during the springtime where non-disabled students might ask out a student with a disability, and it makes the news that like, oh my God, this disabled student gets to go to prom, and it's this like really wonderful, special thing, and good job to the non-disabled kid for like being so kind. And we see these sorts of stories all the time, and I think both in terms of when readers who are disabled see that kind of coverage, it's not helpful, both to readers as well as to like people who might want to join newsrooms, because if that's what we're always seeing of how our story is portrayed, I think it kind of discourages. It's kind of like a cycle where it discourages both like providing space to stories that actually are more meaningful, more in depth. And I know as a disabled journalist, it's oftentimes hard to navigate a newsroom in general where those stories are the ones that keep getting pitched, that keep being given the time and space, when there's just so much more to be covered besides putting us in like the quote good news category.
Yeah. Sara?
So I mostly write about, oh, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, okay, sorry. I mostly write about disability policy and politics. And as a freelancer, I think almost every single pitch I have ever made has been a bit of an uphill battle. It's often difficult to like reframe how editors think about disability, where the stories are either expected to be inspiration porn, which Wendy already covered, or like pity porn, where you really just like everything about being disabled is just horrible and it's the worst and there's no positives and nobody ever has a good day. And I'm really like a lot more, Wendy wrote this really great piece for the Columbia Journalism Review where she talks about the different kinds of journalism and how disability journalism is often like very emotional. Mm-hmm. And that's not really what I'm interested in writing. So it's always a bit of a conversation. It's gotten easier in the last couple of years, definitely, as I've sort of established myself and who I am and what I do. But definitely at the beginning, I felt like I had to explain why people should care.
Right.
And that was always a little difficult.
Yeah, I actually had that same experience because I have done things that are more emotional. And when I wanted to not do it, and like my last piece for The Guardian, I had some trouble with that because I was trying to cover dwarfism as a, like, this is the history of it. This is the history of our discrimination. These are the effects of that. And here's this. And I wrote a script, and then my co-producer said to me, well, can you, he sent it back to me and he said, and I love him, but he said, one of the lines in it was, despite her dwarfism, she has succeeded. And, you know, my dwarfism doesn't have anything to do with my success one way or the other. I work really hard. So, yeah, but I also used to get that in the newsroom. I would write a piece and it would do really well. And then someone would come over to me and say, good gosh, you write so well. And no one else says that. Like, people don't walk up to other journalists in the room and say, you write really well, pat on the head. And I always, and this isn't like a smash on journalism or newsrooms. This is just culture, and the culture seeps. I mean, people are the same people they are outside that they are inside. And so I think sometimes, well, I think all the time, when, you know, it doesn't matter whether it's race or anything, your biases leak in to journalism because you are who you are. And so it's also interesting. And Sara, you brought up something in our pre-interview where we were talking about how sometimes editors will ask you if you're being too biased, if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I've had that conversation specifically, so I'm autistic, and as a freelancer, one of the more profitable things to do is to write for specialty publications. So in addition to the writing that I do for, like, you know, The Nation, or I also write for like some online autism specialty publications because they pay really well, like $1.50 a word, which as a freelancer is yes. And I have been told before by editors in that space that I'm too biased to talk about autism because I'm autistic, which, okay. Specifically, I mean, like, I remember I pitched covering, there's this autism science conference where all these new autistic researchers are coming up, and I was really excited about it, and I pitched it, and they told me I was too biased, and then had someone else write it, and it wasn't as good as I would have done it. Like, they don't think about, like, they think, like, that there's this fake neutrality that exists somewhere where, like, if you have any kind of identity, that automatically taints what you're doing. It's really frustrating. And I'm sure a lot of people have that experience, especially covering, like, issues of race or ethnicity or gender. Like, people just assume that, like, there's some kind of, like, platonic journalist default. And if you're outside of that, then you're too biased to really be a real journalist. And it's really frustrating.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh,
Sorry.
sorry.
You go ahead.
I don't think I've been explicitly told that I am in particular biased to my work, but I have gotten, like, either certain subtle edits or questions that sort of implied that disability, or saying that people with disabilities deserve rights, that just that general topic was very specialty, or that, like, I was sort of driving a radical agenda, which is something that I try to, you know, challenge as much as I can. So I believe that disability coverage, disability rights should be as normalized and mainstream as possible. It's not some sort of niche specialty area. It's truly all newsrooms should be covering disability. And if they're not, they're missing out on a big part of essentially every story in vertical. So that's something that I've been told before, is, like, is disability really even, like, a beat? And I guess in a way, disability should be covered in every aspect of, like, every vertical. So it belongs in sports, education, healthcare, every vertical. But I think what that person was sort of implying was, like, is this even really a thing? So little comments like that.
I've actually had an editor say, is this a thing? and it was a story I was pitching about uh, poverty and disabled people, because I'm not sure. I I think it's like only 31% of disabled people are working full time. I think that's the number. And I was like, well, and I wanted to track it through Social Security payments and the census to see, because also when you're disabled, you have a lot of times you end up having more expenses, and it becomes this disability tax. And so if you're already in a lower economic bracket, plus you have these extra expenses, what does that do to your finances? And the editor was like, I don't think anyone cares. And here's the thing about disability, anyone can join it at any time. Like, this is you. And here's another thing about defining disability. Disability is diabetes. Disability, when people write down comorbidity or a pre-existing condition, that's a disability. And at one point in your life, whether you break a leg or, you know, you end up with Crohn's disease or something that is a normal aging process, you will be in some ways disabled. And so I think we need to normalize the word a bit more and be more comfortable. What was nice was seeing the New York Times doing so much coverage for 8830. And I hope that that will spur everyone else to kind of continue covering it. Because I'm going to segue into this. There's a lot of like culture of disability that I think a lot of people don't understand. They think of it as more of a medical issue and a medical issue that needs to be fixed, rather than a identity like race or gender. It's still an identity that can have medical problems with it, but so can race and all of these other things. And it doesn't mean that that's the whole thing. Have you run into, because I find that when I try to talk about disability culture too, I think there's a misunderstanding that there is one at all. And also, disability culture is so big because there's deaf people, and deaf people have their own culture. I'm a little person. Little people have their own culture. Does anyone want to talk about like culture and disability? Or
Yeah, I think that's something that I really love about being in the disability community is that even just within our community, there's so much diversity. And just because I have one disability does not mean I know anything about what it's like to be someone who's autistic or has some other type of disability. And I think you made a really great point that a lot of people don't even realize that they actually fall under the category of being what it means to be disabled. And not to say that everybody has to identify in a particular way, but like when it comes to the ADA, a lot of people don't rights. They have them because they do technically have a disability. And I know that, like for me, I've typically been one of, if not the only, openly disabled person in a newsroom. And I like to emphasize openly disabled because the reality is that there's so many different kinds of disabilities. I have a visible disability, but there's also a lot of disabilities that are invisible. And so I think that's always important to recognize and for me to remember as well. And I think there's also a lot of stigma, obviously, when it comes to being disabled. So when I think about like in a newsroom or any workplace, when I say I'm one of the only openly disabled workers there, I always try to keep in mind that there might be stigma in the workplace that also prevents people from feeling like they can, share their disability. I mean, that's also like a personal choice. If you decide to, there's no right or wrong way to be disabled. But I think a big reason for that is that a lot of people with disabilities don't even know that there's an entire community and a culture, like you said, and a history behind things like the disability rights movement. I wanted to mention that a recent film, Crit Camp, where it was about a lot of the history behind the disability rights movement. And I remember when I watched it just a few months back, even though I'd already been writing about disability for a while, even just watching the history of that unfold before my eyes just really invigorated a pride inside of me of being disabled. And I know oftentimes when I say I'm a proud disabled woman, a lot of particularly non-disabled people find that very hard to like imagine the two words proud and disabled together, because there's that rooted belief that, the shame and guilt of being disabled. But for me, it's something that I am really proud to be. And I think I feel like disability deserves to be celebrated as a community and a culture.
Yeah, I think that something that like people are missing out about the culture around disability is that, number one, disabled people are, because they've had to be, are the most inventive, creative people out there. And they're also funny, like so funny. Like you're missing out on the fun if you don't know disability culture. Sara, I see that you wanted to get in on this, so I'm gonna.
No, I have something related to the question earlier about the way that editors respond to pitches. So don't let me interrupt. I can wait.
Oh no! Like again, I want this to just go where the conversation goes. So
something I've really run into is a lot of disbelief from editors about some of the things that happen with disability in this country. So it's always kind of interesting pitching something and then going through the piece with an editor and doing the fact checking, because people don't pay attention, and so they end up getting shocked by some of the things that happen. So for example, I wrote a piece about nursing homes that came out in The Nation today, and I talk about how 2/3 of home care workers quit within a year. That's an astonishingly high number. And because nobody pays attention to home care workers or what's going on in terms of long-term care, people don't really hear about it. Or I wrote another piece earlier this year about, I interviewed this man who spent 20 years grinding little bits of metal for less than 3 cents an hour, and they never told him what the pieces of metal were for. And that's a completely legal thing that happened. There's just all these really astonishing stories that nobody pays attention to because they involve people who often aren't seen in public. I tend to focus on people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. That's sort of my background and also the community that I identify with. And there's just so many things that happen to people when nobody's paying attention. It's a little terrifying. And I really wish that more people would pay attention to those stories, because oftentimes they're just astonishing. And I mean, really, more people need to hear them.
Yeah, I read your piece today and it's great. Everybody should read the nursing home piece that Sara just put out. One thing that I think connects this is what, elderly people and disabled people end up in nursing homes. And we as a country need to reckon with that. And if we're not paying attention to these groups, you know, God willing, you're going to end up elderly. Like all of these issues actually affect you. And it's always astonishing to me that there's an entire section of people and a huge chunk, like that's a huge chunk of people to kind of ignore and not cover. Well, you're going to get people trapped in nursing homes and, you know, with COVID, I forget what the figure is and I meant to write it down, but isn't it like 30% of the COVID deaths were in nursing homes?
41%.
41, so it was a little under. So 41% of the COVID deaths were in nursing homes. I know what the number is. It's like 23,000 in New York State alone were in nursing homes and that died. And why, you know, these people are related to people. Like if 26% of the population is disabled, that probably means that you're related to somebody that's disabled if you aren't disabled yourself. And why are we not covering it? Why are we not digging into those issues? They affect everyone because there's not just, you know, part of the reason why people end up in nursing homes is money. It's a monetary issue. So we need to, part of journalism is finding where the money is and where the money needs to be. And we're all going to be old, hopefully. We need to cover this and cover it now and not wait until people die and then say. That's something else I've noticed about covering disability. A lot of it's focused on death. When are they going to die? Have they died yet? Can we let them die? And I don't know that that's the way we should be approaching journalism. We should be approaching it, well, this person has a life, and how do we help them take care of their life? If you're pro-life, we should all be worried about you. And journalism is it's the fourth estate. We're supposed to be finding out where the bad stuff is and rooting it out before people die. And yeah, I also think this also connects to another thing I'm going to talk about is like lack of accommodations and accessibility in the world, which prevents disabled people from participating fully, and which also then connects to inspiration porn. So like there was a little girl that everyone was sharing. I think she had cerebral palsy and she was walking up the stairs and everybody was like, did you see her face? She made it up the stairs. And it was like, or you could have installed a chairlift and let her get up there quickly and easily. And then there's no inspiration there. She's just doing it. And I look at places like New York City where I live, where only a third of the subway stations are accessible. And how does someone get to work? Because they can't, like they can work, but how do you get to work if your public transportation system doesn't work and you pay taxes? Which also leads to accessibility issues. Like Wendy, I read a story that you did a couple of years ago about Newsday and them putting all these requirements to do these jobs that don't need lifting requirements and sitting at the desk for 8 hours. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So that was a piece where basically Newsday had several job postings where they had a lot of job requirements that weren't really like related to the actual role. They had requirements like must be able to lift 25 pounds or something like that. They had, I believe it was certain typing speed, and all of these sort of bullet bullet point items for what it requires to be like a reporter. And so I wrote a piece about the harm in having those kinds of requirements. And it's not just Newsday, this is everywhere. We see this kind of practice in academia, finance, like literally every industry has done this. And it's a way of ending up discriminating against potentially workers with disabilities that you could actually like hire and they would be amazing. Like you would potentially miss out on a great worker if not for this job posting where there are requirements that don't have anything to do with the actual job. And so there are ways to make job postings like that not ableist. You know, if there are a certain number of stories that someone needs to be able to write to do their job, you can list that. Or yeah, and I also recognize that there are some industries where certain physical requirements are like a reality. For instance, in construction. But I think the problem is that too often it's an automatic assumption that people with disabilities can't do a job. And I know for me, I've been in interviews in the past where like an interviewer asks me like if the winter affects me in terms of my disability and if that affects me on the job. And it was like, no, it doesn't. And these are the sorts of questions and barriers that we deal with all the time. And these are barriers that don't come from us being disabled. They're barriers that are imposed on us by society, by employers that put on job postings with irrelevant requirements, and subtle questions during interviews that trip us up because when we're asked about our disability in a way that's not relevant or, you know, in general, I know like when I was in those interviews myself, I walked out being like, man, it's my disability. Like, is that gonna change how they view me as a candidate? And also, why did they think that was a cool thing to do and say and ask? And so there's so many aspects about being disabled in the workplace in general that are really just part of a systemic issue, systemic problem, preventing us from being able to be part of society and be productive.
I also want to point out some problems that a lot of people with sort of more cognitive disabilities have in the workplace where I know I've gone into an interview and come out and I know I've been dismissed because of my disability, because autism affects my tone of voice, it affects the amount of eye contact that I make, and none of that has anything to do with whether I'm a good writer. It actually took me a really long time to find a career that I wanted and to find something that I was good at and sort of find the overlap between like things people would conceivably pay me money for and things I like doing. And like something that's really great about freelancing for me is that like almost all of the communication I have, I don't think I've actually ever had a conversation with some of my most frequent editors, like in person or even on the phone. Like occasionally on the phone when we have to like hash something out really quickly, but it's just been like it's been really great because I don't have to worry about like making an inappropriate facial expression or like being too twitchy or just there's all these like body things that I don't have control over all the time that people judge. And I wish that it didn't work that way. But that is actually something that's been really good about freelancing. The thing is though, like I want to work in a newsroom. Like I've never worked in a newsroom, and sometimes it can just feel really impossible because I know that I come off weird. Like I know that. I'm not like completely oblivious about how I look and come off. So it's just kind of frustrating because like on top of the fake physical barriers, like you have to be able to lift a 25-pound box to do like a desk job. Like there's also these assumptions about like behavior that have nothing to do with work performance.
Yeah.
I actually think a lot of things about my autism make me good at journalism. I have a really strong depth of subject matter. I get really obsessive about what I'm working on. I have some really deep knowledge in some topics. I know a lot of things about Medicaid. And all of those things are perks that I would not have if I wasn't disabled. And so I just feel like people like focus on the negatives and don't see the positives, and it's a little frustrating because they just see like my facial expression and don't see like my talent.
Right.
Sorry, I don't want to sound like a jerk like saying that, but like
No, I think that's a common feeling that disabled, definitely. I mean, like I felt that way. And mine's a little different because mine is all visual appearance. And so people are uncomfortable with me in the room. And they're definitely like, because the images of little people are either demons, like we're demons or clowns. And so then you're like, well, I'd like to write a opus on the Medicaid expansion, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, I don't know if that's for you, because they're used to tattoo on Fantasy Island. And so it is part of, it's almost like circular. It's because we don't get hired, we don't get covered properly, but we don't get covered properly, so we don't get hired. And it's a circle. And at some point, someone's gonna have to break that circle and let people in because you're missing it. Like there's newsrooms are missing it. And it's not really like you should want to be in a newsroom because newsrooms are vibrant, interesting places where ideas get thrown about. And if you want that, like there shouldn't be a barrier for you to be there. There should be accommodations. And, you know, COVID has proven that we can all work from home or not. So why not open the doors a little bit and let more people in who can give you a fuller range of perspective of the world, which we're supposed to be covering. I think also it's because newsrooms are hierarchies. When you get in a newsroom and you're disabled, you most often don't have an editor who's disabled, which is not necessary. It's not, because I've had some wonderful editors who are like, oh, tell me more. And then I'm able to explain it to them and they're open. And then I've also had some where like, nope, that's not a thing. I need you to go back. And you know, I'm Black too. So I know what that's like to also not have any Black editors. And there's a difference. And we're at the Asian American Journalists Association. I'm sure Asian people have the same problem where, you know, you're trying to report on something and you get to someone who doesn't quite get it and they don't want to get it. But there's such a lack of, there's so few disabled reporters in newsrooms. Like most of us are freelancers, that it's hard to seek. I find it's hard to like find a place to go talk these issues out. Have either of you ever had a disabled editor?
I have. I've had the pleasure of working with Eric Garcia at the Washington Post. He's also autistic. I actually run like a small group chat just for autistic reporters. It's called the Michael Falk Society, which is like a reference to this like Onion video from like 10 years ago, where they kind of make fun of the idea of an autistic reporter, like such a thing couldn't possibly be a good idea. So there's like about a dozen of us at this point, and yeah, it's just working with Eric was so good because he just understood like where I was coming from, and I'm so happy that he's an editor at the Washington Post and that he's helping to like get articles about disability that are good published. I really, he's great. I can't say enough great things about Eric.
I have overwhelmingly had, at least not openly, but what I think are non-disabled editors. I can think of at least one that I have had for a recent Refinery 29 piece that I wrote for the 30th anniversary of the AAJA, where it was basically writing several vignettes about some really badass disabled people in like fashion, acting across all different industries, kind of sharing a slice of their life and what being disabled means to them. And I was fortunate to have Kelly Dawson as one of my editors for that piece. And that was really great experience. I am so used to having non-disabled editors because constantly have to explain myself or explain like person first versus identity first language, or why something I'm writing isn't super radical. It's like kind of, I don't want to say basic, but like I kind of have to break down the idea that access is a basic right for people with disabilities, and so I feel very used to having non-disabled editors, that when I do have an editor who is disabled, it's a really nice change. I've never had an editor who shared my same disability. I feel like there's a lot of people with tracheostomy tubes like me, but I haven't met like a lot of journalists with them, and would love to see more, of course. But yeah, it's nice to get one when I do.
Yeah, I've never had one. And I'll say this, I've never had an openly disabled editor. And I actually started out in documentary film rather than writing. I kind of slipped into that. I'm better actually with films, but I never had anyone, and I always wondered what it would be like just to be, because I've had Black editors and Black superior like producers, and I could see where it would be this sort of comfort space where you could just be like this, and this, and they're like, yes, because I've had it with my Blackness, but I've never had it with my disability. If any, like, and I'm not saying like little people, I mean like any kind of disability openly. And I imagine that it's nice.
It was really nice. I'm like, he's also like, I think one of the only disabled editors that I know, like not just autistic, but just disabled. There are so few of us. I think it's just him and Essie Smith over at Talk Poverty, which is like a progressive publication that the Center for American Progress puts out, and that's kind of it. So yeah, it was really nice, and I hope you guys get to experience that one day.
One day. Yeah, so it's 6:15. I'm wondering if we should open up to some questions.
Yeah, it looks like we got a couple in the chat, so I'll start reading them off. This first one comes from John Funabiki, who asks, as journalists, do you think that your personal mission is to report to serve the disabled community or to educate those who are non-disabled? Do you approach stories differently with those two audiences in mind?
Wendy, do you want to, you look like.
Sure, sorry. Yeah, I think this is a great question. And this is something that I navigate relatively often because I personally am very passionate about improving disability coverage in the media. At the same time, it is so important to know that not every disabled journalist wants to just write about disability. And whether we want to write about sports or celebrity scandals or food or whatever it might be, we have such a wide range of interests, like everybody does, not just disability. And regardless of whether or not disability is what we want to write about, we deserve opportunities in the newsroom. And I think oftentimes people with disabilities are sort of boxed in or just like sequestered into only writing or doing things at their job that are just related to disability. And I know, I mean, for me, my disability is a crucial part of my identity, but it's not the only thing that defines me. And so disability, even though I write about the intersection of disability and politics, culture, it's not the only thing that I write about. I also write about AAPI issues. I've written about food, relationships, what have you. So yeah, I think everybody is different, and nobody who's disabled should feel pressured to be that go-to educator on disability issues. Nobody should ever feel tokenized to educate non-disabled people on what it means to be disabled. That shouldn't be our like primary role or secondary, or it just depends on the person.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to say that I choose to write about disability, and that's actually probably unusual. I think most of the disabled reporters I'm aware of write about other things like politics or labor. Yeah, it's you shouldn't expect disabled reporters to write about disability because that's a lot of people have other interests. I'm just a weirdo who really likes policy.
I actually came to disability reporting as out of I'm gonna just say it, out of rage, because I wanted to cover other things. I like clothes and food and culture and that kind of stuff, and then I felt like I needed to write about disability in order to clear a path so I could then write about the other things. And I mean, now I enjoy it, but it wasn't what I set out to do. I set out to, I'm not a policy nerd. I'm an artist more than anything. And so I understand those things a little bit better. I will, if you make me angry enough, I will figure out the policy and I'll write about it, and I will write about how it's wrong, or, you know, figure out where the injustice is, and I'll write about it. But it's not why I started in journalism. It's where I ended up, and I'm fine with it, like happy about it. But I don't know, I feel like that answers the question.
Great. And then our next one comes from Angelica Relente, who asks, how do you think newsrooms should overcome the outdated rules in regards of objectivity and bias, etc.?
Hire more disabled reporters, because it'll, and not only reporters, but also promote to editor, managing editor. You've got to create a pipeline that goes all the way up. And I think what we're all starting to see is that not just with disability, but with other minorities, they'll hire a reporter, and then the reporter has no one to go to, and then they get frustrated and leave. And so then you've not solved the problem. You have to cultivate it and move it up and continue I mean, it's like with anything, like you have to create the culture that allows people to be safe in that workplace.
I totally agree. I think hiring and promoting people with disabilities is crucial, and more than just one disabled reporter, because that's not enough. Not like nobody wants to be that one person, like I said before, who everybody else always goes to for the answer. And even then, sometimes I get questions about like, isn't it tiring to answer questions all the time, like about language and stuff? And questions don't really tire me. I think what tires me is like when I get pushback on projects or like articles or edits where it's directly about the disability issue and something something that I know a lot about, and like when I'm the only disabled person in the room getting pushed back, I think that's really stressful, because then like it's important to trust and respect us. And not saying that, I mean, I don't always ever have the answers either, but truly listening to what we have to say and taking what we're saying to heart, being willing and open to just like acknowledging that we all have bias, I think is really important.
And we have another one from Jennifer Zia, who asks, what stories do you want to see / need to still be told in covering disability?
So much. Like, there's, so AAJA 30 happened. It was July 26th, and there was this rush of stories. And, you know, they did stories about Crip Hop Nation, and they did stories about Ali Stroker. And then, then they had the obituaries from, you know, I'm sorry, Roland
Johnson.
Roland Johnson and Brad Lomax. And like, so there was all this history. So that's scratching the surface, because if they found that much in 1 month, that means there's so much left, and it's across everything, because they've got to, like, we need to dig back into history and go backwards first, go backwards and forwards all at the same time, because disability has not been covered in any, you know, there's people doing it. Wendy's doing it, Sarah's doing it, I was doing it before I got this job, but it's people, like, there's so much out there. It's hard to pinpoint what. There's a lot of history that still needs to be told. And then the current, like, policy and culture and all needs to be covered too. So it's a lot of work, I think.
And then Rachel Ramirez asks, we have a lot of blind spots as journalists. What are important things we should remember with our everyday reporting and writing that are often overlooked? For example, using alternative text, captions, etc.
Does anyone want to answer that?
I guess like one of my answers is more on the reporting end, in terms of like when we cover stories, some of the things that I think are often overlooked. I personally don't use the word blind spot. I prefer a word like oversight or mistake, something like that. It's always making sure that technology or accommodations, things like all captions, providing audio recordings, stories. I feel like oftentimes those are just provided for stories about disability, And I know that things like that do require money and time and energy, but it's important to have those things for provide access for all stories, because just like disabled journalists don't just write about disability, readers, listeners, viewers don't just want to consume media about disability either. And so ideally, things like captions should be provided in all aspects of storytelling. And I know that might seem like a long shot still, but I think that's really necessary. And then, sorry, go back to the reporting aspect really quick. I think when we're writing about disability, it's always important to center the story, center the voices of actually disabled people, because oftentimes stories about us are written from the perspective of parents, caregivers, friends, mentors, literally everybody around us except for us. And so that is something that I see all the time. And I think there shouldn't be assumptions about whether or not it's worth talking to someone who's disabled, because just do it. I feel like that's one of the number one aspects of journalism is if you're writing about a community or someone with a disability or an identity, it's crucial to the story to get their perspective. Without it, the story is incomplete and oftentimes can even just be inaccurate.
I just want to agree with what Wendy said, and also add that I think it's fundamentally important to remember that disabled people that you're writing about are human beings. They are full human beings with preferences, even if they have severe cognitive disabilities, even if they have dementia, even if they don't speak. Like, that's a human person with likes and dislikes and an opinion. It might be harder to ask that person's opinion, but like, sometimes it feels like when people write about like all the people around a disabled person, it's because the disabled person is some kind of empty spot, that like a non-person, and that's really difficult. And I if I could get anything out of journalism, it would be for people to stop doing that.
Yeah, that's actually huge, and that happens. That I think it's reflected in journalism, but it also happens on the street. Like, especially with me, if I'm walking with friends, or if I'm at a restaurant, sometimes people will say, well, "What does she want?" And my friends are like, "She has a mouth and she'll tell you what she wants." And so I think that if you use that in your journalism, when you're writing about disabled people, ask them. And if you need to dig further other places, that's fine. But at least you've done it. Like, you've done it and you can get a quote. And the quickest way to get ratioed on disability Twitter is to publish an article where you speak to no disabled people, and it's only parents and friends and caregivers.
Alrighty, it looks like we're wrapping up right now, but we do have a little bit of wiggle room with Pathable, and so I actually want to bring in Amy Padnani. It looks like she has a question, and I think this is going to be really interesting because she was one of the editors on the ADA special in the New York Times. So Amy, do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Sure, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Hi, guys. I'm so happy that this conversation is part of AAJA this year. It's just so incredibly important. As I know, just from working the last few months on this section, you're absolutely right. We barely scratched the surface of the disability community and all of the issues with it. And I'm really happy to say we're keeping the conversation going at the Times. I almost insisted on that as an editor on this section, that I didn't really want to be a part of a project that was a one-off, that was so incredibly important. So I'm happy about that. I do have a question, which is about allyship. I don't identify as disabled. I have been temporarily disabled. I know I will age into disability. I know that all of us should care about disability regardless of whether you identify as disabled or not. And so it's really important to me to be able to help further the voices of this community. But I know that when the section was published, there were some people who were very skeptical of any of our efforts because the top editors, it wasn't made visible whether or not they were disabled. And so I'm curious to know how to sort of address people who come with that sort of negativity. I understand it. I know it's rooted in years and years of frustration of not being properly covered. But at the same time, as an ally, I want to make sure that I can do my best and actually help people, and that some of those barriers of distrust can come down. Do you know what I could do?
So that's a hard one, because there is a lot of mistrust. Like there just is. And it's from years and years and years. And I guess the best thing I could say is, like, if you keep doing it and showing that you are committed to it, but not only committed to telling the stories, but also committed to hiring. And I think that's the biggest thing, is being committed to hiring more disabled journalists. And I've worked in newsrooms. I know budgets are weird and, like, it's hard to get new spots, but when one opens up, recruit. We're out here. And then support. Once the person gets in there, support them. Like, really support them. I think that will go a long way. I don't know, other than that, like, what will quell that, because I heard it too. Like, it was on disability Twitter. It was all over the place. But I think that's the only thing you can do, is just commit to hiring more disabled people and then supporting them once they get in the room, which is the biggest thing, because you can hire as many disabled people as you want and then not support them, and then they all peace out in a year. And so it's like twofold. You have to hire and then support. I guess that's the only thing I can think of, and continue writing about it.
Hi, Amy. So I guess for anybody who doesn't know, I am one of the reporters who wrote a piece for the New York Times. So good. On 8830. Sorry, Sarah. And I guess first of all, I want to say that I really appreciated my whole experience writing that piece. I think it's one of the pieces I'm proudest of in my career. I feel like, well, I don't want to self-congratulate too much, but I really loved my experience writing it, and also working with my editor, specifically Linda Richardson, was fantastic. I, of course, also saw a lot of criticisms about the section, and I think a lot of them are valid. I feel like there needs to be room for both supporting and celebrating aspects of a section or a news outlet or coverage where they did a great job, and then also acknowledging parts where they might have fallen short. I think that's important for anything, like, to have that nuanced discussion. I would echo what Cara said about hiring and promoting people with disabilities. I think I know one of the criticisms was that there were no top editors who openly identified as being disabled. And I think on one hand, I personally was not surprised, because I've worked in so many newsrooms where I never had a full-time disabled editor. Like, my bar is so low. But even if it's a tall order, that doesn't mean that we should fight for anything less. And so I think acknowledging that, yeah, we didn't have top editors who were disabled who led this, and that was an oversight. That was something that should be rectified. I think listening to the community is such an important step of this. And, you know, whether it's like continuing to bring on the disabled reporters who worked on that section, could include me, I don't know. No, I'm just kidding.
Do it, include Wendy.
And also, I know another thing that people brought up was like on the section, there were a couple pieces that I know people felt didn't reflect the community as much as like so many of the other pieces. Like there were so many wonderful stories about disability, pride, and culture community, alongside a piece about gene editing, which I know got some criticism as well for not centering people with disabilities in that piece in particular. And so I don't know if that requires like kind of even more collaboration in terms of how pieces go together in a section, or what that process looks like. But I think you even just asking that question is asking this question right now, it's such an important step. And I really thank you for asking that and listening and being here. So yeah, thank you.
It is huge that you asked that, because I've had so many editors who were like, I don't know what you're talking about. It's fine. Like everything's fine. And that's why I said, like, as long as you're asking, you're supporting, and like hire more people when you get a space open. And I think a lot of people that were criticizing it don't really understand how newsrooms work. And so when I saw it, I was like, I mean, it is what it is. Like, there's no Black people there either. Like, what? I mean, there are, but proportionately, if you look in newsrooms in higher levels, there aren't, and Latinos and Asians, like there aren't. And so newsrooms have to reckon with all of that. And so you kind of have to like, yes, like Wendy was saying, like nuance, be like, you know, you could have done this, but this was good. And keep talking.
Full disclosure, I was actually really critical of the gene editing article online. And I think when like, Amy, you said the word negativity, and I think that sometimes when you're trying to serve a marginalized group that you're not a part of, you're gonna be told things that you don't want to hear or that make you uncomfortable. And like part of being an ally is sort of learning how to sit with that discomfort. And sometimes the things people want are unreasonable. Like the New York Times isn't going to hire a disabled top editor all of a sudden. Like that's just not how this works.
I'm really sorry to jump in and cut you off, but we do have around 30 seconds left. So I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. This was a really great discussion. It will be available for viewing tomorrow. So please check it out. And then there's the feedback survey dropped in the chat. Please fill it out. And thank you again to Sara, Cara, and Wendy, and our captioner, Bonnie, for joining us today. This was a really great discussion. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming.
I do want to just say that like most of the packet was actually really great. I especially loved Wendy's. So I know I can be kind of critical, but I try to praise the good stuff too.
Thank you all so much. Thank you.
All right, thank you everyone. Take care.